Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Down Syndrome Center podcast. As always, I am your host, Dr. Kishore Volodi. And today we have one of those special podcasts where we have other podcasters who are joining us, who are in this world of working with people with Down syndrome and having a podcast together to be able to talk about what's going on the Lucky Few podcast, which many of you are listeners to. I know because when we are having medical visits, people often say, "Oh, did you hear the last one from the Lucky Few?" So a very popular podcast amongst our families as well. And today it's so exciting to have Heather Avis on the podcast with me. Heather, welcome and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Dr. Kishore. Thank you so much. I'm a longtime listener of your podcast as well, so I'm grateful to get to share on here.
Wonderful. And just, call me Kishore,
Okay.
Dr. Kishore, it's just so formal. Otherwise, I'll have to call you Ms. Avis and that'll be really odd. So let's go with first names on the podcast. Well, why don't we do this? Tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do and why you do what you do, why you love working with people with Down syndrome.
Sure. So my name is Heather Avis. I am wife and mother of three. I am an author and a podcaster, and we run a foundation called the Lucky Few Foundation. We're all about telling the larger full picture of Down syndrome in order to give everyone in the world an opportunity to have some kind of relationship with people with Down syndrome in hopes of shifting the Down syndrome narrative. So that phrase is one that we use a lot, and simply there is a negative narrative that still exists around Down syndrome. And those of us who know and love people with Down syndrome, it's not that it's all rainbows and unicorns, but we come to an understanding of seeing people with Down syndrome as fully human with Down syndrome and worthy of a life and worthy of dignity. And so we want the world to see that too. So that's the work that we do at the Lucky Few. My three kids, my oldest is Mason, and she's 13 and she has Down syndrome. I have a middle daughter, Truly, who is 11 and has no disability. And then my son, August, is 8 and also has Down syndrome. So all three of my kids came to me through adoption. My middle daughter, my husband and I are Caucasian, and our middle daughter is African-American and Guatemalan. So we are a transracial, multi-ability family brought together through adoption. And yeah, so really my kids, I think a lot of parents, they have their first introduction to Down syndrome through their child. For me, it was my first child. So it was also my introduction to parenthood. And it just catapulted me into another space, and ended up talking about feeling so lucky to have a child with Down syndrome, and started throwing this phrase out there, the Lucky Few. It was right around the time social media started. So it just kind of took off like wildfire, and it turned into a whole business. It turned into a whole different life for us. So that's in a real nutshell what I'm doing as Heather Avis.
Yeah. And the Lucky Few podcast, when did it first start? When was the first podcast released?
The first podcast was released on World Down Syndrome Day in 2017.
Wow.
So March 21st, 2017. And the way that started, so by the time the podcast, my first book released called The Lucky Few, on World Down Syndrome Day on the same day was my first book coming out. But prior to that, the idea of the Lucky Few, an Instagram account that had gotten a large following called the Lucky Few, was already very much in the world. And so I have two co-hosts. One of my co-hosts, her name is Mercedes Lara, and Mercedes and I have been friends for years, 15 years prior to kids. She was in my sister was a bridesmaid in her wedding. They were friends first. And she ended up adopting a little girl with Down syndrome after we had. She has her own very beautiful story. And then my other co-host, Micah Boyette, she is an author and a writer as well. And so we had a mutual friend, and I wrote an article for a friend's blog. And Micah reached out to that friend and was like, "Can you introduce me to Heather Avis?" And we just, how you meet those people and you're like, yes, we're best friends forever. Like Micah and I just had that spark. And her son Ace was a tiny baby at the time. And in 2016, she's like, "Heather, we've been friends for a couple of years." She said, "Heather, I've been wanting to do a podcast, and I think that we should do a podcast on Down syndrome." Her story is she was looking about brushing teeth, and she's like, she's an avid podcast listener. She's like, "I couldn't find a podcast on teeth brushing and Down syndrome."
Wow.
And so she wanted to start a podcast, called The Lucky Few, and it's all about shouting the worth of people with Down syndrome. So then I reached out to Mercedes, and one thing that's really important to all three of us is diversity and inclusion within the Down syndrome space, and making sure that we are representing all of Down syndrome, and we know that Down syndrome isn't specific to a race or an ethnicity. And so Mercedes is a woman of color. And I said, we just need to make sure we keep our space diverse, that we have multiple opinions and experiences here. So I invited Mercedes to be a part of the podcast, and then it started.
Wow, that is so awesome. And just for the listeners, tell me again, so lucky few in your perspective, what does that mean to be of the lucky few? As you know, or you may not know, actually, my brother has Down syndrome. And so I've often felt that I was one of the lucky few siblings that had a sibling with Down syndrome. But for someone who doesn't understand that concept, let's say for someone in the community who you're trying to shift this narrative, and their narrative is, oh, having a sibling, having a child with Down syndrome, oh, that's always going to be such a challenge, and oh, you're going to wish that it wasn't that way. What would lucky few mean to that narrative? How does those words help in shifting the narrative?
Sure. So I think that it's a huge shift in the narrative, in that attaching the word luck and being lucky to Down syndrome. In the real short answer is, when Macy first came home, my oldest daughter, we adopted her. So our story is a little bit different in terms of a diagnosis story. We weren't looking for a child with Down syndrome. We really didn't, my husband and I, we were pretty opposed to this idea once we learned about her. And it's a long story, but essentially we said yes to bringing her home. I'd say she was my greatest and scariest yes. And then there's all these ideas around Down syndrome. And I had been a special education teacher. I taught at the high school level. So I had worked with a lot of teenagers and young adults with Down syndrome and adored them. It was just a different narrative when it's your child. And so I was just hearing these outside opinions about Down syndrome. And it's so negative. It's just so negative. But the negative opinions are coming from people who don't know a real live person with Down syndrome. Mm-hmm. And so it's very much like seeped into our culture and society. And so Mason comes home, and within hours, really, I'm just like, this baby is amazing. Like, what were we afraid of? And as the weeks and the months unfolded, I thought I would be in public spaces, and she'd often be the only person with Down syndrome, like walking through Target or at the park. And I just remember thinking, I feel so lucky that she's mine. Like, I can't believe that this child, the only one with Down syndrome in the room, is mine. And I felt so overwhelmed with luck. I just felt so lucky, overwhelmed with gratitude. So I started that phrase, the lucky few, because there's so few of us who have a loved one with Down syndrome, and those of us who do are very lucky. And then as I got to interact with the larger community and meet siblings and grandparents and parents, it was just a very similar story within their own experience. But that thread was similar in that I was terrified of this diagnosis. I thought I was so unlucky. I thought I was devastated about this. And then this human, a real live human, enters my life, and I love them fiercely. And that thing that I was terrified, Down syndrome, yes, it can be really challenging. Yes, it can at times feel so overwhelming. Yes, there's still moments of grief, but I feel so lucky to get to experience life and have my life experiences opened up and shifted in such a beautiful, dramatic way because of this person with Down syndrome. So it's like there's this disconnect between people who love someone with Down syndrome, how they feel about Down syndrome, and what society and the world tell us about Down syndrome. So to be able to attach that phrase, the lucky few, and have the world be like, what are you talking about, lucky? It's a little spark, right? Like a little seed planted in hopes of one day, I don't know that it'll be in our generation, but one day living in a society that views people with Down syndrome as fully human, worthy of a place in this world with Down syndrome as they are, and approaches them with dignity and gratitude for who they are.
That's so beautiful. I can't agree with you more. I think that's wonderful. And I think there's as I've seen it from my perspective now with an adult sibling who's now 47, and the impact that he's having even on my children as they're now teenagers, and they're looking and they're making friends at school that have Down syndrome, not because they feel sorry for them, but because they realize that it is really awesome to have friends with Down syndrome, just like it's like awesome to have friends in general. Just the idea that they see in their uncle is something that they want in their own friends. And I think that generational idea of the impact we can have societally through podcasts like yours, where people might stumble upon it and say, what is this about, lucky few? And they learn that there are people who are actually family members of someone with Down syndrome, and they have a completely different narrative, as you've said, than they may have had themselves before they listened to that podcast. So anyway, it's beautiful, and I love everything that you're sharing there. I don't know if you know, there's actually someone in the Minneapolis area, Jesse Norrell, who I had on the podcast here a couple of months ago. And he wrote a song called, I think the name of the song is The Lucky Few. And I asked him, where'd you get that name from? And he said, from this podcast. Did you know that?
Yeah. I've talked with him. I've heard his music, and we've spoken. It's beautiful.
Yes, it really is. It really is. And so your impact is definitely being felt. And I guess, let me ask you this. When you got together, you decided in 2017, you released that first podcast. Who was your intended audience then? Has that changed over time, or what are you guys who are you looking to impact with your podcast?
Really, our intended audience is moms like us. And we have a lot of dads listening. We have a lot of educators listening. We have health professionals and siblings listening, but it really is like, let's create an environment where we can say, and we say it all the time, we are not experts. We want to share with you what we are living out. We want to be transparent. We want to process through things, in real time with all the other parents. And then we'll bring on experts and let them talk about the topics that we are still learning about. Some of our favorite reviews are moms who are like, I felt so alone. And then I found this podcast. I feel like I'm sitting across the table with my girlfriends having coffee and I feel seen and known. So that really is a big piece of why we do what we do. And I would say our target audience is parents for sure. And we've got a lot of moms listening.
And it's so important. And you remember too, I'm sure, but when I meet new families in my clinic, their number one thing that they're so afraid of is being alone, that nobody else understands, that even their own parents, so the grandparents to the child, don't understand, and they don't know where to turn. And so I think that's beautiful. That this podcast can help in that way. What are some of the topics that you guys typically cover? I mean, you've had, I think, almost 200 podcasts released up to this point. What are some of the topics that people are gonna find there?
I mean, everything. Not everything, but so many things. We always joke that we haven't had a dentist on yet, and that's what started it. was Micah being like, I just need to have something about brushing your teeth. Like, what in the world? Why have we not done this? But we will talk anything from specifics of like potty training and behavior, and we'll have medical professionals on to talk about medical issues, whatever. Like with COVID, we had people on. We talk about dual diagnosis, and then the three of us will bring other people on from another side that's talking about like the value and dignity and worth of a person with Down syndrome. We'll have conversations just about like navigating certain aspects as parents, like education. We'll have OTs on, PTs on, speech therapists on. And a huge theme that's come up over the years that it's just kind of the heartbeat of who we are. It wasn't like this intentional, this is the theme, but it's this idea that there's not a best way to have Down syndrome. It's that we want parents and ourselves, because we're processing it in real time. We want parents to know that their child exactly as they are is enough. Because, there's this hustle. This is just in parenting in general, but I'm sure you saw it with your parents, with your brother, and maybe feel it as a sibling. There's this idea of, okay, so you have this diagnosis now, do A, B, C, and D, and then all the way down through Z. And then the list starts over. And now we're going to go 1 through 100. And now it's 1 through 1,000. It just never ends. And there's this hustle to do what, right? To make our kids less Down syndrome. Like that's not a thing. Right. And so really trying to, at the core of everything we share, let's help our kids be their best self. Here's some tools to do that. And let's remind you as listeners and ourselves as hosts that our kids exactly as they are right this moment, they're enough. And so let's celebrate who they are and walk that fine line of allowing them to be exactly who they are and helping them be their best self at the same time.
Oh, I love that. I love that. So let's say someone listening to this podcast wants to know how they can also listen to your podcast as well. What would be ways that they could find the Lucky Few podcast?
So we are on anywhere you get your podcast. It's just the Lucky Few podcast. We are, if you want to follow us on social media, on all social media accounts, we're the Lucky Few Pod. And you can follow along there. We have a segment we call Good News because we want to celebrate the big and the little and everything in between. So good news could be my child survived open heart surgery, or good news could be my child took a bite of spinach, and we're going to celebrate everything in between there. So there's a place that you can write in for good news. You can visit theluckyfewpodcast.com and find out more. We have all our episodes archived there and show notes and photos and links to everything that we talk about.
Wonderful. And I'll put a link to that in our show notes as well. And then in the book you were mentioning earlier too, what is the name of that book and how would families find that one?
Yeah. So my first book came out in 2017 called The Lucky Few. Mm-hmm. And that's anywhere books are sold. I mean, Amazon's going to be your best bet. Yeah. And then I've written a second book called Scoot Over and Make Some Room, which is for adults. And my debut children's book came out last year in June called Different, A Great Thing to Be.
Awesome. Oh my goodness. That's great. All right. Well, I'll put some links to those as well in our show notes too. But this has been a fantastic podcast. I love the fact that we both share a desire to increase the information around Down syndrome not being something to be quote unquote fixed. I mean, it even bothers me to say those words, but I hear those words so many times, but that we need to learn to love and appreciate everything it is about the people who we know with Down syndrome. And I think that's fantastic. Is there anything else that you would want to make sure that our listeners know before we close this podcast today?
I would love to share actually one more thing.
Yes.
I had mentioned at the beginning about our foundation. So the Lucky Few podcast is under the larger Lucky Few umbrella. And we've got our hands in a handful of things, but we just started this foundation. And the whole point of it, like I said at the beginning, was telling a variety of stories, telling the whole Down syndrome story so that people can see themselves in the narrative, and offering those who don't have relationship with someone with Down syndrome a place to start, because we know how you and I both know this personally and how powerful that relationship is in shifting this Down syndrome narrative. So the Lucky Few Foundation has a project that we're working on right now called This is Down Syndrome. And we've captured about 150 stories so far. And what we're doing is finding a person with Down syndrome and then talking about that person, and then asking those who love that person in whatever capacity it is to share a story about their loved one with Down syndrome. We're doing it through like bite-sized stories, like 400 words or less, because it's 2022 and people don't have much attention span past that. And beautiful photography. And then we're releasing videos. We're trying to release videos about once a month. So the foundation was started for that purpose. This summer, my family and I are going to be on tour around the nation and stopping in 5 different cities to try to capture 300 to 500 stories this summer.
Wow.
And so if that's something you're interested in, you can go to the luckyfewfoundation.org to learn more. There's a donation page there. It's about a storytelling weekend cost about $5,000. And that covers the cost of anywhere between like 25 and 50 stories, depending on the groupings that come. So if you want to help us get those stories out there, help us shout their worth and shift that narrative, you can go to the luckyfewfoundation.org.
Wonderful. Oh my goodness. That's so exciting. That's really great. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a really fantastic podcast. You know, whenever we talk about how to find our own podcast, we say you can search for Down syndrome and you'll find a few that are really not active anymore. You'll find a lucky few and then you'll find ours. And we don't want that to be the case. We would love for more information to be going out there. And I think that having you on this podcast to help to almost share more information than we could possibly share ourselves with one podcast, I think is exactly what we would hope to do in this community. So thank you for joining me today.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. This has been a thrill.
Awesome. And for our listeners, if you have any topics that you would like us to cover or any follow-ups that you would like us to do, please do send us an email at downsyndromecenter@chp.edu. And as always, we would invite you, if you'd like to partner with us in the work that we're doing at our center, and also including this podcast, please reach out to us at givetochildrens.org/Down Syndrome Center. But until next time, bye-bye.